Dave. It's great to be with you. Thank you for allowing me to come along. I do quite a lot of men's breakfast, and I just love being with blokes, basically. And I know Dave, both Daves, work hard on the men's aspect of your, getting together and sharing time together and having a few beers and so on. And I know we need to be a bit careful about what we say, but I do think men need time together, and I think men need to encourage one another and occasionally look each other in the eye and say, come on guys, what's going on here? Why can't we solve this problem? So I just love speaking to men's breakfast and being with blokes. Now I'm going to talk through aspects of my military career and then talk about how I became a Christian and what that meant and so forth and two other things. But I always start off with my favourite quote. For those, I hope you can see it from the back, but I use this quote a lot. It's by H.G. Wells, and he's reputed to have said that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man of high intellectual ability would willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. Well, that's me. I don't think there's anybody else in here who's ex-military, are there? Are there any ex-military? Ah, right, okay. Having said that, I understand that H.G. Wells met Stalin once and left thinking Stalin was a nice bloke, so maybe I don't need to worry too much about his views on life. So I was born in 1951. Obviously just shortly after the end of the Second World War. And of course, Britain was bankrupt and all sorts of things were happening. We all, most of us in this room are old enough to remember most of what I'm just about to say. But I served in the army from 1964 to 2007. And over those years, there was this sort of steady withdrawal from empire. Obviously the big issue over India and the partition of India and so forth in 1947. The great Winds of Change speech. You remember Macmillan making this great Winds of Change speech about Africa in the 1960s and saying we were going to withdraw and hand over to the African countries. And then Dennis Healey, who almost had as big eyebrows as I do, those of you remember him. Dennis Healey made the great East of Suez speech. We were going to pull out East of Suez. Ironically, of course, in the last 20 years or so, we've been back in the East of Suez quite a lot, one way and another, but we'll come back to that. And then Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, sort of fighting withdrawals, really, as we handed over. Having a conflict with people like the Mau Mau and all the other various terrorist organizations and, freedom fighters. And that great expression that emerged over these years, that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. These people are fighting for independence, but amongst them were some pretty brutal thugs, who were doing a lot of damage, the Ochre and so forth. Korea. 1951, 1950 started, 53 it ended with the UN, and that was obviously a fairly major campaign, and quite a lot of people involved from the UK and indeed from Australia and one or two other places. And Oman, which a lot of people don't know about, we had a lot of British forces in Oman. The Yemeni rebels invaded, tried to take over Oman. The then Shah and boss called on the Brits, and we actually ran their armed forces. We provided a lot of air power, a lot of artillery, a lot of engineering, logistics, and all sorts of other stuff. And the guy who ended up by being the commandant at the Staff College wrote a book called We Won a War, which most people had never heard of. And it was actually a really brutal campaign. And a lot of SAS, a lot of special forces involved in that campaign. And we still have very strong relationships with Oman. And then apart from Northern Ireland and some out-of-area deployments, we used to call them out-of-area as in outside Europe, there was then the Falkland Islands in 1982, which I wasn't involved with. Actually, I was doing my guided weapons master's degree in 1982. So we used to go in the morning and listen to the news, and some guided weapon had been fired, Sea Skewer or Sea Wolf or something, get out the books and have a look at the systems and so forth. It was a good time to be studying. And then from 1960 to 1989, the whole focus really, so now coming up to the time that I joined as a cadet, the whole focus is on the Cold War. Which most of us in this room will remember, but some weren't alive at the time. People have forgotten that Berlin was a divided city, 4 parts to it, Russian, American, British and French, with military commanders who had the power to hang people, and was a military, basically run by the military, Berlin in those days. Germany divided between East and West, with an inner German border running through, and a genuine feeling that the Russians, or the Warsaw Pact as they then were in those days, were potentially going to invade Western Europe. Difficult to remember some of those times, but the focus was on deterring the Warsaw Pact from crossing the inner German border, which I'll come back to. And then there was a whole series, the Cold War comes to an end, and a whole series of hot war in the desert, 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, you may remember. I was part of that, and come back to that in a minute. And then there was a whole series of humanitarian and peace support, peace enforcement operations in the Balkans, as Tito died and the whole Balkans fell apart. And then a whole series of wars in Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan, September the 11th, of course, and so on. When the Cold War came to an end, I remember sitting in the officers' mess with a bunch of mates saying, what the hell are we going to do now? You know, there's no enemy, they've all gone away. Well, actually, it was a very busy period. And when people say to me today, should my son or daughter join the military, my answer is always yes, because, you know, there's always something coming around the corner. So those 43 years, there's my time. Cadet in 64, obviously just barely 20 years after D-Day. Most people knew the military well. They'd had fathers, brothers, whatever, serving, or they'd been in the Blitz, or they'd been suffering bombing in Plymouth and Liverpool and so forth. Everybody understood the military. Today, it's a bit of a minority sport. I was a major general, so you go sort of captain, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, brigadier, major general. Most people talk to me and introduce me when I do media stuff as major, because they don't understand the different ranks. I don't mind that much because it keeps me modest, but nonetheless, it does show that most people don't understand the military today. Went to a sixth form college. I left school with 2 O-levels. Those of you remember O-levels? I was completely, that quote from H.G. Wells was pretty spot on for me, I have to tell you. I left school with virtually no qualifications at all. And actually, I would probably not get in the army today. That may sound ridiculous, but to get in the army today, you get on a computer, you fill in lots of forms online, and if you don't tick certain boxes, you're just cut out. And I wouldn't have had the qualifications to get in, certainly to get a commission in the army. But I went to a sixth form college. Having got my 2 O-levels, I then creamed along and got 3 grade E A-levels, for those of you who remember, the lowest possible grade, and then went on to Sandhurst in 1969, 2 years at Sandhurst down the road in Camberley, and then commissioned in 71. And that period of 71 to 89, I did 4 tours in Germany, part of 1st Armoured Division. I was the adjutant and company commander and CO of the same battalion in Germany, in northern Germany. Germany in those days, again, people, forgotten this, but 1989 is basically the end of the Cold War. It's worth remembering in this context that Putin genuinely believes that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Not the invasion of Russia, not the millions that had died in World War II, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is why he's determined to hold on to Belarus, wants Ukraine back, and all these other things he's getting involved with, and feels so powerfully about Crimea. Anyway, 1989, NATO, we had a Northern Army group, BAOR, the British Army of the Rhine, Northern Army group commanded by a UK 4-star general. There was something like 23,000 main battle tanks, 5,000 combat aircraft, NATO, deployed permanently in Germany. And Warsaw Pact had about, as you can see, 54,000 and 6,000. British Army of the Rhine was in northern Germany. Northern Army Group was in the north and consisted of 4 corps, a British corps, a Dutch corps, a Belgian corps, and a German corps. A corps was about sort of 15, 20,000 strong, depending on which nation. The Belgians and the Dutch were a bit smaller. Germans were very strong in those days, and we had a corps of about 50,000. If you include all of the divisions, there were 3 armoured divisions based permanently in Germany. So in northern Germany, if you drove through northern Germany in those days, you would, whatever town or city you came across, there would be a British garrison. We had our families with us, we had hospitals, we had schools, we had the infrastructure, and people were deployed over there. Some guys did 15 years, 20 years in Germany, married German girls and all that sort of stuff. And with our combat support, CS, combat support, things like artillery and engineering, combat service support, logistics, medical and so forth, we were about 50,000 strong. Back in the UK was another division and an air mobile brigade as well, which would reinforce Germany if Warsaw Pact had ever crossed the Indo-German border. And we were facing up against 3 shock army, big formation, which we thought, and I think probably was, very powerful. But as you look at Russia today in Ukraine, you realize actually they're not that great at duffing up the enemy. People say that the Russian army is not that great, but it's very long. In other words, there's a lot of them. And we're seeing that again in spades. I'm sure you know the statistics, but people say something like 1 million casualties the Russians have suffered in the last 3 years in Ukraine. It's always difficult to really know casualty figures, and the death, wounded, lost, captured, and all the rest of it is never easy to pin down. But a lot of people. So that was the Cold War, and then in '77 I did what's called an ammunition technical officer's course, and did a year in Northern Ireland doing bomb disposal work and running a thing called an ammunition inspectorate. In those days, of course, in the early '70s, people have forgotten, in the early '70s, we were taking 300 casualties a year. And the security forces as a whole were suffering at least a couple of hundred deaths. And it's interesting, to put it politely, that here we are all these years later, and who were then young soldiers, now old men, same as us in this room, now being forced to go to court to justify what they got up to in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s. And I know Bloody Sunday is controversial and all of that, but nonetheless, it is a bit ironic. We could come back to it in questions if you want. 1981, a UN tour in Cyprus, a peacekeeping tour, and I'll come back to that in a minute because that's where I became a Christian. 1990 was the first Gulf War. I was part of 1st Armored Division. We were part of that coalition that the UN Security Council passed a resolution very quickly, and General Schwarzkopf, who commanded the whole thing, with Peter de la Billière, who was a senior Brit, Special Forces guy, really excellent bloke. He was the commander of all the British forces. And I served with 1st Armored Division under a guy called Rupert Smith, who I think was probably the best British Army of our generation. And a very successful operation. We kicked him out very quickly and came home very quickly. Of course, the decision at the time was, do we go on into Iraq? And I remember leaning on a Land Rover on the road from Basra City to Kuwait City, literally leaning on a Land Rover. There was a road called the Road of Death where the Air Force had hit and killed a lot of retreating Iraqis. The question was, do we go on or not? And the decision was that we wouldn't go on, which I think was right, because there was an very strong Arab contingent as part of the coalition, Jordanians, Qataris, and others. They would never have stayed with us if we'd gone into Iraq at the time. But one of my great mantras in life is that all choices carry consequences. And the consequences of that we lived with and come back to, of course, a bit later. And then the breakup of the Balkans. Initially, Tito dies. There's a number of wars in the Balkans, essentially between the Croats, the Serbs, and the Muslim communities in Bosnia. Particularly bad. Ethnic cleansing began to hit for the first time. We watched all the ethnic cleansing going on. At the same time, Rwanda was happening. Remember, 800,000 killed in Rwanda, not using modern weapons, but just machetes and everybody slaughtering each other. And the peacekeeping operation, there was a UN force deployed to do a classic peacekeeping operation. We had a battalion there. The Cheshire Regiment went there under a guy called Bob Stewart, who was a Conservative MP for quite a long time. But there was no peace to keep. And in the end, an agreement at a place called Dayton, and NATO deployed a peace enforcement force. British, American, and French largely. We put a division under General Mike Jackson, and an implementation force, I-4 in '95, then a sustainment force following that on, and then the Kosovo force, K4 in '99, which I'll come back to. And I deployed on each of those deployments over that period of time. And then 2002, 2003, those choices have been made. The consequences were that we ended up by invading, obviously, in 2003. I was stood up in 2002. By now, I'd been a brigade commander in the Kosovo operations, a brigadier. I was now a major general, a 2-star, and I stood up to be what was called the Joint Force Logistic Component Commander. When you deploy an operation for the Brits, you deploy normally a 3-star, who's known as the Joint Commander. In this case, it was an RAF officer, really nice guy. And then 5 component commanders: land, air, sea, special forces, and logistics. And I was the logistic component commander, planning and preparing to go if there was going to be a war. At the time, we weren't convinced there was going to be a war. It took us to Central Command in Florida, so we worked a lot with the Americans in Florida at CENTCOM, and did various other things. And then around Christmas time 2002, we were going to put a division in through Turkey. We were going to go through the Eastern Mediterranean, go through Turkey and come into Iraq from the north. And our mission was going to be to take over the northern oil fields and then move into Baghdad from the north. And the Americans were going to come in from the south. But we, the UK, realized that Turkey was not going to let us in. I mean, there's lots of politics we haven't got time to go into, but in the end, we decided to move to the south and go through Kuwait, which of course we'd been involved with all those years earlier. And logistically, I have to say that was a lot easier for all sorts of reasons. So I got rung up by Mike Jackson, who'd commanded, as I said earlier on, in the Balkans. And Mike said, I want you to go to America and join a small team of people who are planning post-war Iraq, a guy called Jay Garner. And I went to Washington with my Navy ADC, a great guy, he was a submariner. And he and I lived in Washington for a while, trying to find out what was happening about post-war Iraq. And it was chaos and a lot of, again, I haven't got time to talk about it all, but the bottom line is we ended up by going to Baghdad in 2003, and I lived in Baghdad for a while through the summer and watched as the whole place fell apart. And we ended up in the middle of a counterinsurgency and a terrorist campaign and all that sort of stuff. And of course, we're still living with the consequences of that to some degree even now. Came back from Baghdad, did a staff job, and then in 2004 took over the UK Field Army. Having said earlier on, we had 3 divisions in Germany and 1 back in the UK. By now, we were down to 3 divisions altogether. 2 of them one of them was based in Germany, 1st Armour Division, 1 based here in the UK, the 3 UK Division, and the largest division actually based here in the UK, which I took over command of. And that included a whole raft of capabilities, things from armoured reconnaissance, artillery, engineering, medical, logistics, signals, and all sorts of other stuff. And deployed lots of people to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And then I retired in 2007. And then I've been running sort of I run a limited company and do various things. I'm on the board of some businesses, do a lot of lecturing, involved in the humanitarian world, as Dave said. And I'm a lay minister in the church too. So for those of you who are going to be around, I'm coming to speak on Remembrance Sunday this year, as long as I'm still invited. So 43 years, war fighting, peacekeeping, peace support, humanitarian operations, et cetera, et cetera. One of the great, get a British general to come and speak, you get quotes from people like Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, because they're the 2 great guys we always quote. Sun Tzu says, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare, there are no constant conditions. And that's certainly been my experience in the warfare side. But I think that's true in life too. As we age, as careers develop, as we marry, et cetera, there's constant change in our lives. And for me, that big change, the big change, was in 1981. I was serving in Cyprus with the UN and got the opportunity to go to Jerusalem. In those days, in 1981, there were a lot of UN operations in the Middle East. I'm sure, again, some of you, quite a lot of you are old enough to remember, but there was the 56 war, then there was the 67 war, the 73 war, Israel in 67, captured the West Bank and so forth, and there were peacekeeping forces in the Sinai, in the Golan Heights and various other places, as well as this peacekeeping force in Cyprus. So I managed to get 2 seats on a UN plane that was doing the rounds between these various forces. And Christian and I went and had a weekend in Jerusalem, just a break really. We left the children with some mates and went to Jerusalem. And we just became tourists really. Now up to this stage, I had been, what I suspect many of you were raised in the same way really. People had asked me, I would have said I was a Christian. I was middle class England, raised in a Christian home, went to church occasionally. Christian and I had been married in church. We'd baptized our children in church. But the bottom line was, it was a cultural thing really. Jesus meant nothing to me. And church was interesting, and I quite enjoyed going to church for various reasons. But it wasn't a dominant part of our lives in any real respect. And I suspect I was not alone in that. So we went to Jerusalem, and it was Easter weekend, and on the Easter Sunday we went to the Anglican Cathedral for the Easter Sunday service. And I remember it very well. And the vicar preached a really good sermon, and we were chatting to people afterwards. And somebody came up to me and said, have we been to the Garden Tomb? Anybody heard of the Garden Tomb? Yeah, 1 or 2. Now this proves how important it is over coffee when you're chatting to people at church or anywhere else, where what you say can really change lives. Because this guy said to me, have we been to the Garden Tomb? I said I'd never heard of it. And he said, well, it's a place outside the old city of Jerusalem, outside the old walls. It's a garden, and in the garden is a 1st century wine press, a 1st century tomb. There's a very large rock formation that looks rather like a skull. and various other things. And he said, that is the place that some people think that Christ was crucified and buried and raised. The other place is what's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is inside Jerusalem and is the sort of traditional place. And frankly, it's extraordinarily tacky and full of tourism and competing Protestant faiths, actually. Actually, not just Protestant, Catholic and all sorts of other people. I mean, literally armed fights sometimes over who controls the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So Christian and I went round to the Garden Tomb. Funny enough, we'd walked past it on the Friday, but I hadn't recognised it. I was a captain in the British Army, and the guide that day was a retired British Army colonel. Can you believe? A God incident, if ever there was one. And his name was Dobby, and we walked around. It was very quiet. It's back in 1981, so it's much better. It's much more known now, and it's a lot busier, I think. But it was very quiet, very peaceful. And he sat me down, or sat both of us down, and he took us through John's Gospel, basically. And if you read the crucifixion story in John's Gospel, it talks about the Golgotha, the rock that looks like a skull, talks about Jesus being crucified, laid in a tomb, talks about a winepress and various other things. And he said, look, he said, this may or may not be the place where Christ was crucified and buried. He said, I believe it is, which is why when I left the army, I came to take over. He was the director of the Garden Tomb at the time. His argument was that if Christ came back, he wanted to be in Jerusalem, and so that's where he was. He said, but it may or may not be the place. The most important thing, he said, is if you go and look in the tomb is empty. Well, feeling a bit of a prat, I stood up, walked over to this tomb, not knowing really what I was expecting to find. Clearly, I wasn't expecting to find a body in it. It was Easter Sunday. It was my 30th birthday that day. And as I leant on the entrance to this tomb, I suddenly found myself thinking, this is actually quite an important question. If Christ did not rise from the dead, if that tomb was not empty on the first Sunday morning, Easter Sunday morning, then frankly, we're wasting our time. Dave has wasted his life running a church. Paul says in one of his letters in the Bible, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we of all people are to be pitied because we're wasting our time. Hundreds of millions, billions of people believing that the Christian faith is built around the resurrection of Christ. That's the center of gravity of it. That's the foundation. So if he didn't rise from the dead, then it's a waste of time and, forget it, move on. But if he did rise from the dead, then for me anyway, something had to change. I mean, I had to recognize that this was actually quite an important question. Great mate of mine, a guy called Ian Dobby, Major General, commanded all the artillery in the First Gulf War, massive artillery brigade. Ian was a great mate, sadly killed in a car accident in Romania doing some work over there some years later. But Ian used to argue that most people become Christians by traveling on the M1 or the M2. The M1 is the Damascus Road, 1M in the word Damascus. And the Damascus Road is the road that Paul was on when, you remember, he was killing young Christians and persecuting the early Christians. Goes to Damascus with some instructions from the Jewish leadership to go and arrest the Christians and carry on the persecution there. And on the road, in simple terms, he meets the risen Christ. He hears Christ calling him and says, Paul, Saul, as his name was then, why are you persecuting me? And when he says, who are you? He says, I am Christ, I'm Jesus Christ. So there's a huge emotional, heart-driven meeting with Christ on the road to Damascus. The M2 is the Emmaus Road, 2 M's in the word Emmaus. And if you remember the story, Christ has been crucified, he's been buried, and you can imagine the disciples are all pretty jarred off, confused, frightened, they scatter. 2 of the disciples walk home to a village called Emmaus and are walking home when they meet a bloke on the road. And the bloke says to them, you're looking a bit fed up, what's going on? And they say to them, haven't you heard what's happened, etc., etc. Cut a long story short, the bloke they meet is Jesus, and we're told that Jesus opens the scriptures and explains to them why what happened had to happen. In other words, it's a head-driven, intellectual thinking about the faith. And they go, Jesus stays with them and then he disappears and so on. So the M1, emotional, heart-driven, M2, intellectual, head-driven. Now, it's not one or the other completely, and this, when I leant on that entrance to the tomb, it wasn't an emotional experience as in Paul. If the truth is, I am a bit of a head-driven intellectual bloke. I like to work things through and so forth, so I had to go back. I went back to Cyprus with Christy, my wife, and I had to think about this, chatting to some Christian friends who I knew, reading the Bible, and so on. And at that stage in my life, I suspect, like some of you maybe, I'd spent my life going around the M25, going absolutely nowhere spiritually. And essentially what I was being challenged was get off the M25 and go up the M1 or the M2. Make a choice. Get off the fence. And I think, frankly, going back to one of my opening comments, a lot of us men need other men to look them in the eye and say, come on, get off the flipping fence. Make a choice here. And when you make the choice, then live with it. Don't say, oh, yes, well, of course, I think Jesus is a great guy, and then completely ignore him and just get on with the rest of your life. It has to make a difference. So after about 3 or 4 months in Cyprus, I literally just decided I was going to become a disciple of Christ. And, change my life, transform my life. And it's the best decision I ever made. So what did that mean? Well, the first thing, as you can understand, would be I'm a soldier, been involved in various things already, and I was obviously going to be involved in other things. Can I stay in the army? Can you be a Christian in the military? And I lecture on this quite a lot over time, but cut a long story short, I just went through the scriptures looking at, trying to decide how the Bible talks about being military. Lots of different stories. Luke chapter 3, John the Baptist. Remember, John the Baptist is baptizing people, for those of you who know the story. A bunch of soldiers go and see John the Baptist, and they say, what must we do to be saved? John the Baptist doesn't tell them to leave the army. I always think rather regretfully, he tells them to be content with their pay, which is, a bit surprising, really. But I think what he's saying to them is, don't abuse your power. Soldiers were not well paid, and they often supplemented their salary by protection rackets and all sorts of other things. So John doesn't tell them to get out of the army. He just says, be content with your pay. Don't abuse your power. Jesus meets a centurion on the road, and the centurion says that my servant is really ill. Can you come and heal him? And Jesus, after a conversation, Jesus says, yep, I'll come. And the centurion, a Roman centurion of an occupying power, the centurion says to Jesus, no, you don't need to go anywhere. I'm a soldier. I told people what to do, and they do it. I told people to come, and they come. All you need to do is give the word of command, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus turns to all the people around him and says, I've never found faith like this anywhere in Israel. It's an extraordinary statement. He doesn't say, you're a soldier, I can't possibly come. You're a Roman soldier. And Jesus says that, and then the centurion then goes home and discovers that his servant is healed, and discovers that the servant was healed at the moment that Jesus said what he'd said. The centurion at the cross says, surely this man was the Son of God. Peter, one of the apostles, has a dream, told to go to see a guy called Cornelius in Acts. Cornelius, again, is a Roman centurion, a Roman legion centurion. He's probably the first non-Jewish, i.e. Gentile, i.e. us, non-Jewish family baptized into the Christian faith. He gets this vision. Peter has a dream. They meet up. Peter's really worried about meeting this bloke for all sorts of obvious reasons. But the bottom line is, in the end, Peter baptizes this family. So there's, again, something fundamentally wrong with being a soldier, a Christian soldier. Would God really have chosen a Roman centurion to be the first Baptist family baptized into the Christian faith? Soldierly behavior, Paul talks a lot about that. Probably more controversially, and some of you may disagree with me here, recognizing I've been in the military for a long time. Luke chapter 10, there's a story where Jesus sends out the disciples and says, don't take sandals, don't take any money, don't take any spare clothes, just get out on the road and speak the gospel, heal people, raise the dead, do all sorts of stuff. And it's a mission, and they go out and it's a great success, and they come back and say how wonderful it was. In Luke chapter 22, on the night of the Last Supper, the night before Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, gets arrested, and the crucifixion, they're in the upper room having what we now call Holy Communion. And Jesus says to them at one point in chapter 21, do you remember when I sent you out earlier on without anything? And they all say yes. He said, well, now I tell you differently, And if you read the story, he actually says, and if you haven't got a sword, sell your jacket and buy one. And one of the disciples says, oh, we've got 2 swords here. And Jesus says, that's enough. Now, this is an interesting conversation we could have for a long time. I've discussed this with a senior theologian at Oxford, a guy called Nigel Bigger. What is Jesus doing with swords in the upper room at the communion service before he's arrested? What's he doing allowing those swords to be carried into the Garden of Gethsemane? And we know he does, because one of the swords is used to take the ear off one of the people who come to arrest him. If Jesus is a pacifist. I don't think Jesus is a pacifist. That is not the time to use force, but he's telling the disciples, life is going to be tough, and other issues too we haven't got time to go into. More controversial, you may not agree with me, but it's an interesting read, and if you feel like it, have a read of that chapter in particular. So I came to the conclusion, and this is the story from Acts where Peter goes to Cornelius. Peter says, I now realize how true it is that God doesn't show favoritism, but accepts men from every nation who fear him and know what is right. And I think the good Lord needs Christians everywhere, and he wants people to fear him and to do what is right. He wants Christians in the military, he wants Christians in politics, in economics, in business, in education. He'd quite like a few in the church and everywhere else. Sorry, a bit of a snipe. So, fear him and know what is right. So, I decided I would stay in the military. How do I then behave as a Christian in the military? Lots of stories I could share with you. 2 quick ones. One from, first of all, Joshua. You read the book of Joshua, you remember the story. Moses doesn't go into the promised land for various reasons. Joshua takes command of the Israeli nation. He takes command of the Israeli military. They cross the Jordan at the beginning of the Joshua story. And then I think it's chapter 5, somewhere about chapter 5, there's a story of Joshua on his own, walking on his own, just before the first battle of what will be a campaign of about 40 battles to secure the promised land. The very first battle was called the Battle of Jericho. Well done, yeah, the Battle of Jericho. And when I read the story, I've been there. The night before you go on an operation, the night when you're just about to go off and deal with some stuff in Northern Ireland, when you're preparing to fight a battle, as a commander on your own, you're obviously thinking about certain things. Are we going to win? Am I going to die? What's going to come out of this campaign? So Joshua's on his own thinking about this, and we're told he meets a man dressed in armor. And he asks him a very sensible question. Are you on their side or are you on our side? And the man says, neither. But as the commander of the Lord's army, I have now come. Now, I have to tell you, if somebody tried this with me, probably I would have got the sergeant major to arrest them. But Joshua, we're told he falls on his face, takes off his sandal and says, what are my Lord's commands? He's then given the most ridiculous battle plan that anybody could possibly have come up with. He's told, march around the city 7 times, blow a few trumpets, the walls will come down, it'll be fine, you'll win. Joshua must have thought, this is crazy. I mean, the traditional way of taking a city was to put it under siege and all that sort of stuff. But he does what he's told. And we all know what happens. The walls come tumbling down. So what does that tell us? Again, we haven't got time to go into it all. But for me, the big message was, God is not a mercenary to fight on my behalf. He's not an Englishman. He's not an Irishman or an American or a South African. He is God. And it's not about whether he's fighting for me. The question is, am I on his side? Not, is he on my side? And we all know the stories of armies on both sides of a battlefield claiming that God is with them and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's a really important issue. As we fight as soldiers, as we live our lives, the issue is, are we on God's side? Do we fear God and are trying to do what is right? The second story is Gideon. Maybe remember the story in Judges. Gideon is hiding away. He's the least of the least, as so many of the biblical leaders are. He meets an angel, gets him out of there and says, you're going to command this army. You're going to have a battle with this Midianites, a bunch of pretty brutal thugs. And Gideon asks a very sensible question, just like Joshua. Are we going to win? And God says to Gideon, yeah, you're going to win, but there's a problem. What's that, says Gideon? The army's too big. Assemble the army and get them in front of you and tell them that if they don't fancy a fight, they can go home. I have to tell you, I never tried this with my brigade on operations. Of the 32,000 in the army, 22,000 of them thought, better things to do, I'm going home. He's left with 10,000. Still too big, says God. Take him down to the lake and get them to drink water from the lake. Those of them who lift the water in their hands to their mouths, you can keep them. Those of them who lean down and lap the water like a dog, you can send them home. Quite a good military principle if you think about it, because if your head's down lapping the water, you're not watching what's going on around you. 9,700 of them lap the water like a dog. Gideon's left with 300, with which he fights a brilliant maneuver warfare battle. The Midianites are slaughtered, and he wins the battle. Now again, lots of issues we could talk about, but what comes out of that? Great message through the scriptures. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. This is not about numbers. It's about, are you on my side, as in God? Are you on God's side? And his spirit will lead us through the battles of life. And those two stories and many others led me to believe that that's what I needed to try and recognize and realize. And that it's all about seeking justice and righteousness. Being a force for good. What did that mean to me? Well, again, I haven't got time to go. I'm just going to focus on one deployment, which Dave touched on, and Macedonia. The collapse of Yugoslavia. I'd done the I-4 and the S-4 deployment. Kosovo broke apart. Ethnic cleansing. You remember the Serbs were killing all of the Albanians living in Kosovo. Kosovo province was a very important place for Milosevic and Serbs for all sorts of reasons. But the war started. And of course, having broken up and several other campaigns beforehand, Kosovo is down here, or just here. Here's Macedonia, here's Kosovo, Albania. A lot of people then start leaving, going into Albania as the war gets worse. And a lot of people leave Kosovo because, lots of stories, but essentially people were literally, somebody would knock on the door at 10 o'clock at night and say, if you're still here with your family at breakfast, we're going to kill you. So I don't, what goes through your mind? What do you do in those circumstances? Well, the bottom line is you get out, basically. Most of the men headed for the hills to fight as part of the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, who were not all wonderful people. They were pretty nasty bunch amongst them, but nonetheless fighting for their independence, freedom fighters, terrorists, whatever. But the women and the children and the old people basically were kicked out of their homes and headed away. And when I watched all the refugee movements across Europe a couple of years ago, when we watched these boat people and all the rest of it, very mixed emotions for me personally, because I have huge sympathy with these guys, but I know politically it's not easy and there's all sorts of other issues. But anyway, huge numbers of people on the move, young, old. To chaos. Now I was commanding a brigade. It was a logistic brigade, so I had medics, I had engineers, I had loggers, I had all sorts of people, well prepared in inverted commas to do something like this. But we'd never done it before. We'd never prepared for this in any sense. A guy called Joe Hegenar met me. He was the guy who was looking after or commanding the UN High Commission for Refugee Force inside Kosovo, a team of about 10 people. And he, as a result of all of this, if you remember, Milosevic didn't stop bombing, didn't stop killing. NATO started bombing Serbia, and you remember the all sorts of incidents, the missile through the Chinese embassy and all sorts of other stuff. So lots of people on the move, overpowering what they were capable of doing. And Joe took me to the border, and I took those photographs at the border. By then, there were probably 15,000, 20,000 people living in fields on the border with Macedonia. Tens of thousands had gone into Albania. And Joe said to me, I just can't cope with this. He was a classic humanitarian. He didn't like the military much. And he told me afterwards he hated asking the military to help. How did Joe find me? Because we'd never met. Question. So I went back to my brigade headquarters and I said to my staff, I think we're going to be involved in a crisis here, a humanitarian crisis. 2 days later, I got a phone call from the Macedonian Foreign Secretary. I was literally in a field, and he said to me, if we let these people in from the border, because they were coming under quite a lot of pressure from the international community, if we let these people in, can you guarantee to me that you will look after them and not allow them to go anywhere else inside Macedonia? Which sounds a bit harsh, but every other country had had their civil war. Macedonia were really worried about a civil war, so he wanted some sort of, guarantee. I hadn't got a clue. I mean, what I didn't know. But I found myself thinking, and this, in a way, I've got to be careful about overplaying this, but this is my sort of Joshua Gideon moment. He didn't want a conversation. He didn't want me to say, oh, I'll just check with the MOD back in the UK, see what they think. He wanted an answer. So I just said, yeah, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And I went back to the brigade headquarters and said, we're going to start building camps. How did Macedonian Foreign Secretary find me? I mean, we had Mike Jackson was the K4 commander. There were lots of generals around. I was only a brigadier. I think, that is, I've got no doubt at all, that is the good Lord making connection and knowing that my response would be yes. Now, it wasn't just a pure heart-driven emotional thing. I recognized at the time too, there was a military imperative here. If we didn't do something about this, there was going to be a major war in Macedonia, and we were going to be sucked into the middle of it. And we were supposed to be going going into Kosovo. So I rang up a mate of mine who runs some refugee camps in Thailand. That's a young-looking me. And I said, I'm going to have about 60,000 refugees to look after. What do I do? He gave me some very good advice, and that's what we ended up by doing, building and running refugee camps for about 3 or 4 months. We then went into Albania, did the same in Albania for a while, and then eventually we went into Kosovo and did the rebuilding, helped start the rebuilding of Kosovo. We ran the railway system for a while, ran some camps, did all sorts of other stuff. It was a fascinating deployment, but I'm absolutely clear that was part of justice, righteousness, doing what the good Lord wanted me to do, and the reason that I'd stayed in the military and had been where I was. And that would apply to all you guys too. Where are you in your businesses? Where are you with your families? What is the Lord calling you to do? The decisions and choices you have to make. How do you make those choices? What's behind, your choices? So just in case it all sounds wonderful, of course, I then ended up in Baghdad, which I said earlier. Massive strategic failure. I lived in Baghdad for a while. I briefed the Prime Minister, briefed Rumsfeld, briefed Jack Straw, Claire Short, all sorts of other people. The whole thing was chaos and uncertainty, and it was failure. And I only say that to say that being a Christian doesn't mean to say life's easy. We all face tough choices. We all face disasters. We face health problems, marriage breakup, children who go, do all sorts of bad things, etc., etc. So it's not about, everything's going to be rosy. That's not the way it is. But it is about understanding that throughout that process, good Lord is with us. I don't think we've got time for that. Just to finish with this one, in the context of all of that, another Sun Tzu quote: if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles. He who knows others is strong. He who knows himself is invincible. Who are you? What do you stand for? What is your purpose? What is your identity? Where are you rooted? And if you can understand that, then you need not fear the outcome of the battles in life. And of course, I would say that my identity is rooted in Christ. My purpose is rooted in serving as best I can. And my foundation is Christ. I'm not a great fan of religion, not even a great fan of a church, actually, but I am a great fan of Christ. And that's what I want to root my life in. So go out as a pilgrim, seek out danger, pitch your very souls against the unknown, and seek stimulation in the company of the brave. I love that quote. Get out there, make a difference, and live your life with a sense of purpose and clarity. Thanks very much, guys.